Today I'm going to read something from Camus. He's a French author, a novelist, a playwright, a writer, and he has been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature at one time. And I want you to go through this. These are the lyrical and critical essays. And while reading them, you sort of get an idea that it is his ability to stay near the plain, uncelebrated habits of the life that gives Camus his particular strength, and his thought is so down to earth. That is, they all his writings illuminate new facets of his usual subject matters. And if you've seen this is I've taken from the French library, and it's translated by Alan Conroy Kennedy. The preface is very good, and I took up the first, what do you call it, critical essay. I've taken the lyrical essays, the wrong side and the right side. In that I've taken up irony. So we're just going to read irony. 2 years ago, I knew an old woman. She was suffering from an illness that had almost killed her. The whole of her right side had been paralyzed. Only half of her was in this world, while the other half was already foreign to her. This bustling, chattering old lady had been reduced to silence and immobility. Alone, day after day, illiterate and very sensitive, her whole life was reduced to God. She believed in Him. The proof is that she had a rosary, a lead statue of Christ, and a stucco statue of Saint Joseph carrying the infant Jesus. She doubted her illness was incurable, but said it was so that people would pay attention to her. For everything else, she relied on God. She relied on God. She loved so poorly. One day, someone did pay attention to her, a young man. He thought there was a truth and also knew that this woman was going to die, but did not worry about solving this contradiction. He had become genuinely interested in the old lady's boredom. She felt it, and his interest was a godsend for the invalid. She was eager to talk about her troubles. She was at the end of her tether, and you have to make way for the rising generation. Did she get bored? Of course she did. No one spoke to her. She had been put in her corner like a dog. Better to be done with it once and for all. She would sooner die than be a burden on anyone. Her voice had taken up a quarrelsome note, like someone haggling over a bargain. Still, the young man understood. Nonetheless, he thought being a burden on others was better than dying, which proved only one thing, that he had surely never been a burden to anyone. And of course, he told the old lady, since he had seen the rosary, you still have God. It was true, but even here she had her troubles. If she happened to spend rather a long time in prayer, if her eyes strayed and followed a pattern in the wallpaper, her daughter would say, there she's praying again. What business is that of yours? The invalid would say. It's none of my business, but eventually it gets on my nerves. And the old woman would fall silent, casting a long, reproachful look at her daughter. The young man listened to all this with an immense, unfamiliar pain that hurt his chest, And the old woman went on. She'll see when she's old. She'll need it too. You felt that this old woman had been freed of everything except God, wholly abandoned to this final evil, virtuous through necessity, too easily convinced that what still remained for her was the only thing worth loving, finally and irrevocably plunged into the wretchedness of man and God. But if hope in life is reborn, God is powerful, powerless against human interests. But if hope in life is reborn, God is powerless against human interest. They had sat down at table. The young man had been invited to dinner. The old lady wasn't eating because it's difficult to digest in the evening. She had stayed in her corner, sitting behind the young man who had been listening to her, and because he felt he was being watched, he couldn't eat very much. Nevertheless, the dinner progressed. They decided to extend the party by going to the cinema. The young man had blithely accepted without thinking about the person who continued to exist behind his back. The guests had risen from the table to go and wash their hands before leaving. There was obviously no question of the old lady's going too. Even if she hadn't been half paralyzed, she was too ignorant to be able to understand the film. She said she didn't like the movies. The truth was, she couldn't understand them. In any case, she was in her corner, vacantly absorbed in the beads of her rosary. This was where she put all her trust. The three objects she kept near her represented the material point where God began. Beyond and behind the rosary, the statue of Christ or of Saint Joseph opened a vast, deep blackness in which she placed all her hope. Everyone was ready. They went up to the old lady to kiss her and wish her a good night. She had already realized what was happening and was clutching her rosary tightly in her hand. But it was plain they showed as much despair as zeal. Everyone else had kissed her, only the young man was left. He had given her an affectionate handshake and was already turning away, but she saw that the one person who had taken an interest in her was leaving. She didn't want to be alone. She could already feel the horror of loneliness, the long, sleepless hours, the frustrating intimacy with God. She was afraid, could now rely only on one man, and clinging to the one person who had shown any interest in her, held on to his hand, squeezing it clumsily, thanking him in order to justify this insistence. The young man was embarrassed. The others were already turning around to tell him to hurry up. The movie began at 9 and it was better to arrive early so as not to have to wait in line. He felt confronted by the most atrocious suffering he had ever known. That of a sick old woman left behind by people going to the movies. He wanted to leave and escape, didn't want to know, tried to draw back his hand. For a moment, he felt an intense hatred for the old woman and almost slapped her hard across the face. Finally, he managed to get away, while the invalid, half rising from her armchair, watched with horror as a last certainty in which she could have found rest faded away. Now there was nothing to protect her, and defenseless before the idea of death, she did not know exactly what terrified her, but felt that she did not want to be alone. God was of no use to her. All he did was cut her off from people and make her lonely. She did not want to be without people, so she began to cry. The others were already outside in the street. The young man was gripped with remorse. He looked up at the lighted window, a great dead eye in the silent house. The eye closed. The old woman's daughter told the young man she always turns the light off when she's by herself. She likes to sit in the dark. So just imagine, it's an insight into the loneliness of the old. So very well put.